Howdy, everyone. Sorry for the last video. It kind of ended abruptly. So this video is primarily going to be about the Mexican War for Independence, but I'm just going to finish up a couple points on this slide. Some people had the PSATs and didn't get a chance to go over this in class. So we were noting about the Cadiz Constitution, which is this very, very liberal constitution that goes down in Spain. And it's, the hope amongst Creoles and maybe some other people that this constitution will filter down to the Americas. We see the rise of Morales, who follows Hidalgo. Hidalgo's movement ends up not being successful. It's quite violent. Some of the Creoles in the movement drop out. It becomes hard to maintain it, and people get sick of some of the violence, so it kind of peters out. Hidalgo is actually executed, and ultimately there is kind of a winding down of that entire movement. But the group of people who wish to rebel kind of continue. We still get groups that are small and ultimately solidify under Morales, who, like Hidalgo, has an initiative to spread some greater equality. So he does get both Creoles and some groups of people in like the lower part of the socioeconomic framework underneath. They also join, but you have kind of different motivations for different groups. He does try to tackle things like ending forced labor and ending slavery, but he also tries to build nationalism amongst people who are Creole, that they are closer to the indigenous people. There's even this kind of highlighting of indigenous people that gets like politicized a little bit. We're all American kind of thing, and there's like a downward glance at the Peninsulares. So Morales has a little bit of this going on. It's a fairly successful movement initially, like Hidalgo's, but also over time it peters out. And for a long time period, we actually get very little happening. Napoleon is out by 1814. Ferdinand the Seventh is back. And you would think that when Ferdinand the Seventh comes back, that there would be a lot of goodwill between the Cadiz Constitution folks, the liberals kind of in Cadiz, and Ferdinand the Seventh, that they might be on the same page, but they're not at all. Ferdinand the Seventh comes back with his like monarch power, and he's going to crack down both in Spain as well as in the colonies. And so his intention is to try to resist any type of junta, liberal thinking, Morales's actions, all of that Ferdinand the Seventh wants to crack down on, and he starts to organize military to do this. By 1820, this has totally failed. There's actually a huge movement of Spanish military that fight back against Ferdinand the Seventh. So there is no effort to rein in the colonies and kind of crack down by the Spanish monarch. By 1820, the Spanish monarch is forced to embrace the Cadiz Constitution, and this seems to also apply to the Americas. So by 1820, we have a very different flavor. Creoles, who before were fighting for equality, fighting alongside indigenous people, by 1820, some of the Creoles are very nervous about the idea of way too liberal of a Mexico or way too liberal of a South America, because there might be some worry about the social order shifting. Okay, so kind of that Creole stepping up and being the new Peninsulare starts in the 1820s. Okay, let's look a little bit at the Mexican War for Independence and also South America. So just so we can see, there's going to be, by the end of the Latin American Wars for Independence, a whole bunch of new countries. We're not going to go into the breakaway of Paraguay and Uruguay. We can certainly look at Chile. We can certainly look at Peru, Venezuela, and Argentina. Brazil is kind of a separate a revolution in and of itself, one that's bloodless. But the first one we'll really look at is New Spain. Keep in mind that we do have, the Creoles, who become very much a part of the movement. are going to be leaders in a lot of the movements. Morales wasn't a Creole, he's like technically a mestizo, but, for all intents and purposes, we get quite a bit of Creoles who are going to be leading this movement. Remember, the Creoles really don't, they have certain things. They have wealth, they have access to education, so they've got some economic privileges. They even have some social privileges, especially in relation to other folks in the Americas, but they don't have the ability to participate in like high jobs in the military or high jobs in the Spanish viceroyalty. They're really excluded from, the government coming from Spain, right? That had been traditionally the case. The Creoles do embrace Enlightenment ideas. How would they know about them? Well, like Father Morales, he is somebody who's a college professor. In his teaching, he's reading a great deal of even prohibited texts and telling other people about them. Some Creoles, so take somebody like Simon Bolivar, actually experience education in Europe and spend time in places like Britain or in other societies where they're getting a great deal of Enlightenment education. There's a Venezuelan activist military leader prior to Simon Bolivar, whose last name is Miranda. He too spends time in, with the colonists who are fighting the British. So people have been a part of other revolutions. Simon Bolivar goes to Haiti. There's a great deal of relationship between the Latin American revolutions and the Enlightenment, and the Latin American revolutions and previous revolutions in America, in France, and in Haiti. Okay, so we do see the demand for Creoles for political rights, right? And that's one of the things that becomes a trend in South America and Mexico. Okay, and we'll see that people, mestizos and indigenous peoples, often fight alongside Creoles for those various rights. Okay, you can see on the map Mexico City. You can see on the map Dolores, right? The city of Dolores. That's where the rebellion begins. And, you can kind of note that in 1810. Okay. Father Hidalgo, definitely know a little bit about his biography. He's a Catholic priest, and he is a little bit atypical. He's somebody who is kind of a womanizer, somebody who doesn't always listen to the rules. He is a little bit, of a not necessarily always a player in terms of following the rules, but he does have quite a strong relationship with indigenous communities. Some of this is through his work in the church and where he's located. He grew up in some cases with indigenous peoples and mestizos. His father was a poor Creole, and so there were quite a few people who might have been working in his father's stead. His father was like a manager on a hacienda, so he's not like a great landowner, even though Miguel Hidalgo does become that. But he will start this cry for Dolores. We don't know exactly what he said. He probably didn't use the independence word, but he does speak about, the rights that people should have, the problems that people face. And there is a massive famine going on in 1810 in areas of Mexico, especially where silver mining had taken place. And since the Bourbon reforms, there's like all these efficiency efforts to kind of drain Mexico of its silver, and lots of indigenous peoples pay the price for that. And so they have had it, and Father Hidalgo kind of takes advantage of that and gives, let's say, an Enlightenment era type speech. He will ultimately build an army from city to city to city of 80,000 people, and these will be really against Peninsulares and other Creoles who start to side with Peninsulares, people who are trying to maintain the status quo. As Hidalgo's movement continues, it becomes fairly violent. Father Hidalgo doesn't necessarily stop some of the violence. He kind of understands and sympathizes with it, but we see a great deal of violence and more Creoles kind of peeling away from this kind of radicalizing revolution and moving away from the violence and kind of coming to a little bit more conservative space. And the movement eventually peters out. It's fairly militaristic, and there is armed battle. Father Hidalgo is not a military leader, and he makes a a few significant mistakes about not going after some of the Peninsulares leadership, and he ends up maybe giving up some military moments, and there is a whole bunch of military disadvantages. Okay, Hidalgo's actually captured, he's executed, and then ultimately we see this rebellion kind of rise up again within, another few years. So after Father Hidalgo, things kind of get quiet, but this concept of rebelling, the dreams of equality, some of the goals that mestizos have or that Creoles have, doesn't necessarily, go away. And keep in mind, the Peninsulares have a great deal of power in the viceroyalty. So as people are fighting, it's not necessarily like the Spanish military fighting against Morales. It's other Mexicans who are favoring, the old system that, benefited Peninsulares and wealthy Creoles. They're fighting against these revolutionary Mexicans, right? So you kind of have patriots and royalists against each other, and that's what this looks like. By the time we get to the, kind of turning point, by and I'm going to go back a second just to kind of emphasize, because this slide doesn't really describe it, that new leaders are found. The leadership of Morales is probably even more, even though Hidalgo gets a lot of credit for starting the Mexican War for Independence. Mexico's Independence Day is the day that Hidalgo did the cry of Dolores, the cry for Dolores, but he is followed by a mestizo leader by the name of Morales, and that movement is even stronger, has more military strength, is more likely to be successful. Ultimately, it isn't. There is a capturing of Morales, who's also killed. So there's kind of these efforts to try to build these rebellions, and it ultimately doesn't work. But by 1820, things are very different, right? Creoles clearly switch sides and join the revolt against Spain. This is really a turning point where Creoles are joining the revolt, not necessarily, they're really turning against the revolutionaries and against the Cadiz constitution. They are really seeking the older version of the viceroyalty that came with the Peninsulares, in charge. And we see by 1820 kind of a deal that gets cut between Creoles and, the Peninsulares at this point are largely moved out. They are either moved out or they are so discriminated against, completely moved out, killed in some cases. The Creoles become, in a sense, the leaders of what becomes a new government. There is some language that appears in 1820. There was a constitution written under Morales. That constitution is fairly based on egalitarian principles. By 1820, some of that could continue, but it doesn't necessarily go that way. Iturbide becomes kind of a Creole leader who steps in and basically will take on an emperor type role and pull the Creoles into a power, type of political move where economically and politically Creoles kind of maintain the power. What doesn't happen at the end of the Mexican War for Independence, what does and doesn't happen, there is political change. There is the Creoles kind of get into the top dog political space, and there's no longer a mother country. There will be, widespread independence and a new constitution that provides certain degree of rights. But we also have a kind of recipe for a single leader to really assume most of the power, which is what happens. And we get a great deal of disunity amongst factions of Mexicans who are either fighting for this new Creole kind of leadership or Creoles who are not in favor. So after Iturbide, he is, he leaves and comes back and he's shot. Other leaders are either going to be representative of various factions who can't seem to gain a majority. So the unrest politically is very significant, despite the fact that there's new political rule at the end of the Mexican War for Independence. There's still a lot of political upset, which is what brings Mexico to a new revolution in 1910. There is, however, economic and political power for Creoles where they kind of enter into the peninsularis spot. So there's some political change. For indigenous people and for, mixed race people, we see no social change. So what does not happen as a result of the Mexican War for